There are questions that remain open. They are discussed, they are debated, they are investigated, but they are never resolved. And for a time, that is acceptable, because uncertainty can be tolerated, but only up to a point. Because eventually, a question stops being interesting and becomes a problem for institutions, governments, and systems that depend on certainty. And when that happens, the question must be answered, not necessarily correctly, but definitively. In the 1960s, the United States faced exactly that problem. The question was simple, but its implications were not. What are UFOs? And more importantly, do they represent something that must be taken seriously? Welcome to UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I am your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for joining. Please subscribe, share the episode, and today's is titled The Condon Report, the study that closed the door. To understand the Condon Report, we must first understand the environment that created it. In the 1940s, in the late 1940s, reports began to appear. Pilots, civilian, military personnel, all describing objects in the sky that did not behave as expected. These reports were frequent, inconsistent, and difficult to explain. The US Air Force responded with a series of investigations: Project Sign, Project Grudge, and eventually Project Blue Book, each attempting to answer the same question: what are we seeing? By the early 1960s, Project Blue Book had been running for over a decade. Thousands of cases had been reviewed, and yet no definitive conclusion had been reached. Most cases were explained, attributed to natural phenomenon, or misidentified, but a small percentage remained unexplained. This created a structural issue, because even if 95% of cases were solved, the remaining 5% kept the question alive. And as long as the question remained, so did public interest. By the mid 1960s, UFOs were no longer just a military concern, they had become a public issue. Newspapers, television, public discussion, wide media attention, all focused on the unexplained. Scientists began to engage, some curious, some open to investigation, but many others were skeptical and dismissive. At this point, we see a divide forming between those who believe the phenomenon deserves study and those who believe does not. This is where everything changes as the university enters the story, because the question is no longer left to the military, it is handed to science. University of Colorado Boulder, for example, the US Air Force commissions a study, not internal but external, independent, an academic study. At the center of this study, Edward Condon, a physicist, a respected scientist, chosen to lead the investigation. So why was Condon selected? Because he represented credibility, scientific authority, and public trust. But this was not just an investigation. It is a transfer of responsibility from military uncertainty to scientific authority. Now, we arrive at something critical, and that's the real question behind the study. The stated purpose of the study was to determine whether UFOs represent a scientific problem. But the deeper question was, should this topic continue to be taken seriously? This is not just about UFOs. It is about legitimacy, whether the subject belongs in science, deserves funding, and warrants continued investigation. From the beginning, there was an expectation, not necessarily stated, but implied. the study would resolve the issue and provide clarity, direction, and closure. And this matters because systems cannot operate indefinitely under uncertainty. At some point, they must decide. By the late 1960s, the stage is set. Everything was in place. A long history of investigation, public interest and pressure, scientific involvement, and institutional expectation, all leading to one moment, one report, one conclusion that would determine the future of UFO research. Part 2, the study, the conflict, and the contradiction. When the study began, it did not begin as a conclusion. It began as an investigation, a structured effort to examine UFO reports, observational data, and patterns across cases. Under the direction of Edward Condon at the University of Colorado Boulder. The structure of the study was a project that brought together physicists, engineers, and analysts with the stated goal to determine whether UFOs represent a phenomenon worthy of scientific study. Now, what does this imply? And this is important. The goal was not what are UFOs, it was are UFOs worth studying at all? And that distinction shapes everything that follows. As the study progressed, something began to emerge. Not a clear answer, but a pattern. Hundreds of UFO reports were examined, many were explained, but some remained unresolved. And just like earlier investigations, most cases explained, a small percentage unexplained, but here's where it becomes critical. The unexplained cases were not dismissed. They were acknowledged as genuinely puzzling, and this mirrors Project Blue Book. This means the data did not eliminate the phenomenon, it confirms something remains unexplained. Now we move into the part most people never hear about, the internal tension, because inside the study there was a disagreement. Some researchers believed the phenomena deserved further investigation. Others believed it did not. This core divide created a split between data-driven interpretation and institutional expectation. And this matters because this is the moment where science meets pressure, not necessarily external pressure, but expectation of outcome. At one point, a document emerged within the project known as the Low Memorandum, authored by project coordinator Robert Low. The memo indicated that the study could be structured in a way that would appear objective while still leading to a predetermined conclusion. This is not proof of conspiracy, and we need to be careful here, but it is evidence of strategic thinking about how the study would be perceived. And this is a key moment, perception versus process, because it introduces perception as part of the outcome, not just the findings, but how those findings are presented. After years of work, the study produced its final report, a large document, detailed, containing case analysis, technical discussions, and observational breakdowns. At the very front of the report was a summary, and that summary stated, UFOs do not represent a subject worthy of further scientific study. Now, this is the turning point because this is the statement that matters, not the data, not the cases, but the conclusion. And this is where we arrived at the contradiction. And it's the most important insight because when you look deeper into the report, something becomes clear. Inside the report, some cases remain unexplained. Some are described as unusual, difficult to interpret, lacking clear explanation. But the conclusion states no scientific value. We now have data that contains unresolved cases and a conclusion that dismisses the entire subject. This is not about whether UFOs are real, it is about how decisions are made. In any large system, most people do not read the full report. They read the summary, they read the conclusion, which is why it matters more than the data. The summary becomes the narrative. It is what policymakers use, media reports, and institutions respond to. The complexity of the data is replaced by a simple conclusion, and that conclusion becomes reality. Following the report, the US Air Force made a decision to end Project Blue Book and to state UFOs do not require further investigation. And this is the impact. This was not just a decision, it was closure. After the report, the scientific community largely adopted its conclusion. UFOs became a topic outside mainstream science, and this is where we see the birth of a stigma. This is where the stigma begins, not from ridicule, but from institutional disinterest. So let's step back for a moment. We now have a detailed study containing unresolved cases, producing a dismissive conclusion which is accepted by institutions, and that leads to the end of official investigations. This is where we're going to step into part 3, titled Stigma, Silence, and the Return of the Unknown. When the report was released, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but decisively. The question of UFOs, which had remained open for over 2 decades, was no longer treated as unresolved. It was treated as closed. Following the conclusions of Edward Condon's study, we saw that institutional shift. The United States Air Force ended Project Blue Book, ceased formal investigation, and publicly stated no further study was required. Closure does not mean the problem is solved. It means the system has decided to stop looking. Now, there is a difference, and this is critical, because it introduces a distinction between resolution and termination. The UFO question was not resolved. It was terminated as an area of active inquiry. Once the decision was made, the effects began to spread. It was the creation of stigma, not through policy, but through culture. After the Condon Report, most scientists avoided the topic entirely, not because it had been fully disproven, but because it had been classified as unworthy of study. And this creates something powerful. It's a social mechanism, a condition where engaging with the topic carries risk, not physical risk, but reputational risk. Stigma does not require censorship, enforcement, or prohibition. It only requires disincentive. The result? UFO research moves out of universities, out of formal science, and into the margins. From the late 1960s into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, a pattern emerges. There is no major government program, scientific initiative, or institutional focus on UFOs. We've got official silence. But there's public persistence, because yet the reports continue. Pilots, civilians, observers, still describing unexplained phenomena. Now, we have a divide or a disconnect between experience and institutional response. The gap widens because the system says this is not worth studying, but observers say something is still happening. When official channels close, something else happens. The conversation moves. And this is where we see the rise of alternative narratives. We see the movement from institutions to culture, books, films, and media. UFOs become a topic of fascination, a subject of speculation, a foundation for storytelling. Without formal study, structured analysis, and institutional engagement, the topic becomes uncontrolled. different interpretations emerge. We see narrative expansion, extraterrestrial, secret technology, and conspiracy, all existing simultaneously without resolution. But decades later, something changes, not in the phenomenon, but in the system. In the 2000s and 2010s, military encounters begin to surface. We see the re-emergence of UAPs. Pilots report objects moving at extreme speeds, objects without visible propulsion, objects behaving unpredictably. But this time there's a key difference. This time the observations are recorded on infrared, radar, multi-sensor systems. The system can no longer ignore it because now there's data that exists within the system, so it must be addressed. And this is where the language changes from UFO, unidentified flying object, to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. Why this matters is because this shifts the focus from object to behavior. This allows the system to re-engage, investigate, and analyze without reopening the stigma of the past. Now we connect everything because the return of UAP investigation did not happen in isolation. It happened in the shadow of the Condon Report. The Condon Report established that UFOs were not worth studying. What that created was decades of silence, stigma in science, absence of formal research. But today we see a system that must now rebuild its understanding after decades of disengagement. Now let's apply our strongest layer, the intelligence lens. Systems prioritize closure over uncertainty. When faced with unresolved questions, systems prefer definitive conclusions, even if those conclusions are incomplete. Narratives can override data. The Condon Report demonstrates that a summary can define reality, even when the data is more complex. And stigma is a structural outcome, because once a topic is dismissed, engagement decreases, not because the phenomenon disappears, but because interest becomes costly. Absence of study does not equal absence of phenomenon, and we saw that. The silence that followed did not eliminate reports. It only eliminated formal investigation. And the return of UAP as a system correction. Modern UAP programs represent a re-engagement with something that was prematurely closed. So let's step back one final time. We now have a long history of observation, a decisive institutional closure, decades of silence, and now a modern return. And at the center of it all, one document, the Condon Report. The Condon Report did not prove that UFOs are real. It did something more important. It determined that the question itself was no longer worth asking. And that decision shaped everything that followed. Because in the end, this was never just about UFOs. It was about how systems deal with uncertainty. And when uncertainty becomes inconvenient, the system does something very specific. It closes the door, not because the question is answered, but because it no longer wants to ask it. And for decades, that door remained closed until something forced it open again. This is UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for listening. Please share the episode, and I'll leave you with one last thought. Sometimes the most important question is not what we discovered, but what we chose to stop looking for.